If you've been on social media at all this week, there's a good chance you'll have seen this photo of Cristiano Ronaldo and Lionel Messi, two of the world's best footballers, playing chess on a Louis Vuitton suitcase. Well, it turns out there's a lot more going on in this photo than you might have first realized. So, firstly, I didn't realize this until I asked my girlfriend, but apparently Louis Vuitton are renowned for making trunks of a similar pattern to the one on the suitcase. They've just kind of changed it slightly to add the squares for a chessboard onto this one. Also, this suitcase or a similar one was actually used for the World Cup 4 years ago as well, for bringing the World Cup trophy to the stadium in a Louis Vuitton trunk, which is another reason, another little detail in this photo that links to football as well. And then with the chess links as well, with a nice little detail, the position in this game is actually from a famous game that really happened. They didn't just make up a position like many chess films or photos being staged would do before. In this game, it's actually a game between Magnus Carlsen and Hikaru Nakamura from 5 years ago, and in a real position, in a position that was better for Magnus, who's Cristiano, but the position ends in a draw because of the rules of chess. Basically, nobody could actually make any progress, and nobody could win, which presumably is why they've chosen that game for Ronaldo and Messi's game, because being probably the two greatest players of all time, certainly of this generation, and some people prefer Messi, some prefer Ronaldo, but overall it's very hard to separate them. So yeah, it seems like the perfect game to choose for representing as a metaphor Ronaldo and Messi in this generation. And this photo was taken by the renowned photographer Annie Leibovitz for the annual Louis Vuitton fashion shoot. And yeah, and it's broken the internet this week. Second most liked photo on Instagram ever on Ronaldo's account, behind a picture of an egg, I believe. And yeah, it's just another way that chess has been brought into the spotlight recently. Um, yeah, and in today's video, I just want to go through that game that was played between Magnus Carlsen and Hikaru Nakamura that Ronaldo and Messi are playing in this game. So this is the game that that photo of Cristiano Ronaldo and Lionel Messi is based on. It was a game that took place in 2017 in Stavanger in Norway, in the fifth edition of the Norway Chess Tournament, between Magnus Carlsen and Hikaru Nakamura. Magnus was playing as white, or Ronaldo, and Nakamura is playing as black, or Lionel Messi. So the game starts with a Sicilian by Nakamura, open Sicilian, very, very common, played millions of times already. We have a6, which is a Najdorf. If you're new to chess, Sicilian Najdorf with a6 is one of the most very common but very, very complicated version of the Sicilian defense, and I wouldn't recommend trying it as a beginner, but as intermediate or above player, it's a good opening, but very complex and with many different forms of it. Of h3 and g6, which is setting up a bit of a Sicilian dragon, but it's a late dragon, so some people have called it a dragon dwarf. I don't know if it's an official term with the Najdorf and the Sicilian dragon, but that's what we have. We have g3, potentially giving the bishop a fianchetto square here on g2. Knight c6, bishop e3, and both sides do the fianchetto on the g file. Castles and castles. So we have a very typical sort of opening. Played this sort of game many times myself. Um, Generally meant to be slightly better for white, but nothing much at all in it. We have knight d7, um, double threatening that knight on d4, maybe allowing the f pawn to be pushed soon. Also, Hikaru played knight d7 because he's hoping that Magnus will just swap off these knights and then potentially allow Hikaru to have rook b8 threatening the b2 pawn later on, which explains Magnus's next move, which is b3, just to prepare for that later on so that the b2 pawn wouldn't be attacked. And also later on, Magnus is maybe hoping for like a knight e2 or knight to d5 and then play c4 just to bolster the center and around this d5 square. So now Hikaru just swaps off all the pieces in the middle. He's done this because he hasn't really had much space so far in the game, and he wants to get his pieces active and get rid of White's more active pieces there, which is what happened. And now White's queen is in the center of the board. We have b6, trying to activate that bishop to b7. What Magnus plays knight d5, as I said, he puts that knight on one of its favorite squares in the middle, attacking a couple of pawns and giving it more space to Magnus in this position. Bishop b7 to attack the knight. Notice that black could have played e6, but this would drive the knight out, but would actually weaken the position after knight e3. This pawn would be hanging, could be defended potentially with queen c7, but then rook d1, and this pawn is just a huge weakness. So instead of doing that, we have bishop b7, and Magnus plays c4, just to bolster that center even more, put everything behind that knight on d5. And now we have pawn e5 to force Magnus's queen out, goes back. And now we have b5, trying to break up that bolstering pawn on c4. Magnus defends, and we swap off the pieces. He takes with the rook because he wants to keep the rook on the open c file. And now Hikaru swaps off the bishop for the knight. Slightly unusual. Usually you think that bishops are better than knights because they can control more of the board in one go rather than the slow knights. The reason for it though is because in this position the white bishop is biting on granite with that pawn on d5, and this square on c5 is perfect for the knight because the light squared bishop can't get rid of that knight, and you don't really want to give up an exchange to get rid of the knight. The only thing that Hikaru needs to do is get this pawn to a5 to stop pawn b4 happening, so that the knight can just sit pretty on c5 forever, which is why Hikaru plays a5 as his next move. Magnus doubles rooks on the c file. Now that knight comes into c5, a square that's going to be very hard to shift it from. Now we have a3 from Magnus trying to play b4 and get rid of that knight. And now Hikaru starts to move on the other side of the board. F5, taking space. Hikaru is gradually getting more and more space in this game. B4 now, swap the pawns, and now Hikaru is going to finally have to move that knight off c5. He goes back to d7. We have rook c6, which attacks the pawn on d6. And Hikaru just ignores that and decides to play an in-between move. Plays f4 to attack the queen in between. In this position, Magnus could move the queen away somewhere, probably to c3, just to triple up on the c file. But he probably didn't like the weakening of the pawn structure if black just takes the pawn. And he certainly didn't want to give rook Hikaru this open f file for his rook, which is why Magnus decides to just snap the pawn straight off, and Hikaru takes back with the pawn. Queen e6 check. Looks pretty appetizing for Magnus right now. Rook f7 to block, and now Magnus grabs the pawn. So Magnus is a pawn up, approaching the endgame. So it looks pretty good for him right now. King safety is a little bit open for both sides. That missing g pawn for white could be important afterwards. Let's see. With queen g5 pinning the bishop on g2, and Magnus slides out of the way. Now we have f3. Very important move. Obviously, Magnus can't take because he would lose the bishop, and then black's going to get into his position realistically. So other than that, so white plays the obvious move, the only move, which is bishop f1, to get out of away from the f3 pawn. We have knight f6, trying to bring that knight into the attack on the king side. Notice how Hikaru is getting more and more active in this game. That pawn on f3 is, if this bishop moves, as you can see, it'd be checkmate in one move. So Magnus has to be careful and has to watch this knight potentially coming into g4 later on, coming into the attack on the king side. We have queen e6, repinning that rook on f7 and allowing this d pawn to finally start running. He did not play that. He did not hang his rook. He hanged the checkmate in one move. After queen e6, we have king g7, unpinning his rook. Rook c7, and Magnus trying to swap the rooks off the board, which Hikaru does. And we have king h6. The king just jumps out of his house into safety on the side of the board. And he is actually perfectly safe. I mean, Magnus has been better through most of this game. Not a winning advantage, but better. Always having more space, usually having a bit more material as well. But despite Magnus having these two passed pawns, the computer says it's exactly equal. And the reason for that is because if Magnus plays like an obvious, like push the d6 pawn forward, we have rook a1, and the game is lost for Magnus. There's nothing he can do. He's gonna king h2. He just loses the bishop, and checkmate might be on the way very soon. So Magnus actually has to play queen e1. He has to play a defensive move, just kind of getting rid of all of the progress he's made because he realizes that he can't checkmate Hikaru with the queen and rook by itself. So he just went back. Rook a2. Now Hikaru is the one who's coming more and more into the game. Rook e7, and now knight g4, which does, as it looks like, hang a knight, which Magnus accepts. But we have queen h4 and king g1, queen g4, king h1, and yeah, we're just going to have a repetition of moves because if after queen g4, Magnus, it might look to the untrained eye like he can just play king h2 and queen h4, bishop h3, and Magnus has escaped, right? Well, not really. Rook f2 check, king back to g1, and now black he's in. It's his mate after queen g3, king h1, queen h2. So Magnus can't do that. So we just have a repetition of moves, and yeah, that's the end of the game. A draw between the two titans of chess and of football. Thank you so much for watching today's video about Cristiano Ronaldo and Lionel Messi's world famous photo. If you liked today's video, please consider giving us a like or subscribing to our channel. If you have any comments, then please just you know what to do down below. And thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.